Good morning, Dawg Nation. I am Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. And believe me when I tell you, as emphatically as I possibly can, it is great to be back with you live. Wonderful week away from me last week. Good time with family, but super excited about settling in for some Georgia football talk here today. Jon Stinchcomb will be a part of that. Recruiting wins for Georgia will be a part of that. Also, very interesting statement about perhaps who one of Georgia's top players will be here this season and why that will also put him in the conversation for among the top players in the country. That's on the way here today. But to kick things off, and I've already had some people talking about this just in the streets here before the show begins today, Kirk Herbstreit has called out a fairly well-known Georgia fan. If you're not aware of this, it happened over the course of the 4th of July weekend. I don't think you're going to be super happy with this, but I think you'll be entertained by it all. It is certainly pretty wild. So what do you say we begin? A little bit of a jab by Herbstreit in the direction of a Georgia fan. Seems like a pretty fun place to kind of get it going. What do you say we do it? It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. And it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, viewed to be the best.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
So great to be back after a week away. You guys are always kind to let us enjoy some of that time with our family during the summer as we kind of get ready to get into the swing of things for the 2025 season. This year, kind of no different than that. You're great to let us do that. We certainly appreciate that. We're thrilled about being back. I will say very relaxing week for me overall. I come back really energized, really ready to go. The one, I guess, counter example to that, yesterday I did one of the most harrowing things I've ever done. I'll mention this for like 2 seconds, and then we'll get into the action. Yesterday, went to the brand new Buc-ee's in Brunswick, Georgia, which its opening weekend happens to coincide with like the Sunday after the 4th of July. When I tell you that was one of the wildest experiences I've ever had in my entire life, it was. I did survive it, though. The one example of something like super stressful and chaotic in the midst of an otherwise really sort of serene week. So thankfully I did make it out alive, made it here today. So we're thrilled about all of that. And, you know, it's always kind of fun looking at the stories that pop up while you're gone and what sort of catches my mind. We're going to do a lot of those here today. One thing from like 4th of July weekend that kind of, I guess, came to my attention, I thought this sort of seems like kind of a fun place to start today because I think there are a couple of points that need to be made off of this. We're not going to drag the guy too bad necessarily, but it's one of those things I've had some Georgia fans bringing up. Hey, did you see this? Did you hear what so-and-so said? I'm talking about here Kirk Herbstreit, who was on a podcast. There's a guy named Jon Crist. He's a comedian. Herbstreit goes on his podcast, and they're talking about all kinds of stuff. But one of the things that does come up is Herbstreit's, I guess, belief that as a broadcaster, he has such an important job that in no way can Herbstreit, you know, show any kind of favoritism for his alma mater, that Herbstreit can't reveal himself to be an Ohio State fan, that the sanctity of the broadcast is so important. Herbstreit's credibility, that's a word that he uses. Herbstreit's credibility is so important. He could never have anyone think that he might prefer his alma mater, Ohio State, just because he played there, just because he went to school there. It's something apparently he takes very, very seriously. Let me give you an example of this. The host is a guy named Jon Crist. He is a comedian. Herbstreit, a guest, talking about the standard that he holds himself to when it comes to being a broadcaster. This is from 4th of July weekend.
The days of objective, does that make sense? We don't know. This guy's just sitting here, and now everybody's...
I totally disagree with that.
You do?
Yeah. Now, if you're a personality like a Bill Simmons or a Pat McAfee, or like a Stephen A. Smith, that part of their shtick is kind of that. Yeah, I think they're very, like, even on game day, Pat, West Virginia, like he's always talking. Like, I never do that about Ohio State, ever. And that's why a lot of Ohio State fans probably don't care for me, because I treat Ohio State like every other team.
So that's Herbstreit saying, I treat Ohio State like every other team. There are plenty of non-Ohio State fans who may not exactly agree with that. But the truth is I do think sometimes Herbstreit has gone so far to make people think that he doesn't have some sort of affection for the place where he went to school or something like that, that after a while it does just sort of get a little bit weird. I really do think that I know that, people kind of rag on Herbstreit all the time, or any broadcaster, for a supposed bias about whatever. But if anything, I think that Herbstreit has been guilty in the past of sort of going so far with that, because all of these guys have agents. Their agents are always telling them, hey, you got to be more than just the place where you went to school or whatever else. And I think those kinds of consultant tips or agent advice or whatever else, I just think it sometimes ends up getting inside the head of these guys. And I frankly think it becomes a little bit of almost like a brain rot, or a form of like sort of thought poison, where it's like you turn yourself into kind of an animatronic version of yourself. You're going to turn yourself into a robot. But Herbstreit apparently takes that version of himself very, very seriously. I would say that at times Herbstreit kind of comes across to me as a guy who takes himself just too seriously in general. And that particular clip is an example of that. Oh, I'd never be one of these guys that's talking about my alma mater, or talking about my favorite team, or talking about whatever, that I just simply can't do that sort of thing. That's what Herbstreit says. In fact, and this is where Georgia comes into this, and this is where you'll be more interested. In fact, in the midst of all of this, Herbstreit then calls out one of his fellow ESPN colleagues, a person who does a different job but works for the same company, mentioning, do you know who Elle Duncan is? Mentioning Duncan by name as someone who hosts SportsCenter, but in the midst of hosting SportsCenter, has made it very clear she's a Georgia sports fan. She loves the University of Georgia. She calls the Dawgs on air. She's talking about Georgia. She goes to the Feinbaum show all the time. She's talking about Georgia there. Like, Elle Duncan has been very open in her Georgia fandom, and apparently, according to what Kirk Herbstreit told the comedian named John Crist, that's the sort of thing that he doesn't think is appropriate at all. Listen to Herbstreit calling out a fellow ESPN personality. Elle Duncan is her name, for her Georgia fandom. This is Herbstreit again.
I don't think you can cheer when you do games. It's like on a national level. But you're right. Yeah. Guys that are in a studio show nationally, you watch SportsCenter, and Elle Duncan is sitting there cheering for Georgia.
She's Georgia,
openly cheering. Yeah. So I'm not a fan of that personally, but
I guess I only know.
I think it hurts your credibility.
So all of a sudden you've got Herbstreit, it hurts your credibility. I'm not a fan of Elle Duncan doing what she does. And if you're Elle Duncan, you got to be sitting there thinking, listen, I'll be honest with you. Elle Duncan's not always my cup of tea, totally, to be totally frank. I thought some of the stuff that she did with Stats Minute a couple of years ago was kind of weird. I was not a super fan of that. So, Elle Duncan's, whatever, she can defend herself on this if she wants to. But the point is I'm sure if she hears this, she's like minding her own business on the 4th of July weekend, and all of a sudden, she's got Kirk Herbstreit calling her out on some random podcast that's not necessarily even a sports podcast. I'm sure she's kind of wondering, wait, how did I get dragged into this? How do I get involved in all this? Why is my name in your mouth when it comes to all this? And Georgia fans hear this and sort of think of Elle as kind of, one of our own on that. And so a lot of Georgia fans sort of rally around this of, how come you got to call out the Georgia fan? And how come you got to pick on what, frankly, is like one of the last few Georgia fans even left at ESPN? How come you got to do this if you're Kirk Herbstreit? I'm sure Elle and some of Elle's admirers would perhaps be thinking that way. So before I give you sort of my larger thought on all of this, let me give you some additional context of what someone like Elle Duncan, the ESPN personality, does as a SportsCenter host. In fact, it was almost exactly a year ago, getting like at SEC Media Days. We've got SEC Media Days coming next week. It was at SEC Media Days a year ago, and kind of joking around with Nick Saban on air. Elle Duncan kind of gave an example of what she does a pretty good bit, which is just sort of letting you know, hey, I'm a Georgia fan. I come at this from a partisan perspective. I am like the audience. I've got a favorite team. I've got preferred outcomes in games. That's the only reason anyone ever watches sports to begin with. I am human just like you. And last year, interviewing Nick Saban as a little bit of taste of the thing that Kirk Herbstreit sort of says threatens your credibility as a broadcaster. This is Elle Duncan from a year ago. Just to give you a little context, if you're not super familiar with who Elle Duncan is.
Words to live by from the great Nick Saban, who brings us all his insight from SEC Media Days. Coach, we appreciate you so much for joining us here.
All right, thank you. You want me to say go Dogs or what?
Can you? Too late, we got it.
No.
You got it. Got him.
So this is the thing that Kirk Herbstreit is just beside himself. Credibility threatened because Elle Duncan would dare say go Dogs on air, or dare joke around with Nick Saban, or dare be such a Georgia fan that Saban would know to joke with her on air. That somehow Elle Duncan's credibility is threatened by all of this because we happen to know who she cheers for. And we happen to be aware that when Elle Duncan watches a game on TV, she does have a favorite team and therefore a preferred outcome in the game that she's watching. This is the thing that Herbstreit is apparently so bothered by. Now, let me give you sort of 3 small points on all of this, and then we're going to shift gears and talk about something different. Here are 3 reasons why I think this story matters. Thing number 1 is this. Y'all, I think about this a lot. Like, AI is coming. And we're not really a show that's sort of like, devoted to those sort of topics. But I do think about this. I think about one day, will AI be able to do my job better than I do? And look, if you're not at least considering that as a possibility, no matter what job you do, because, there's a lot about this I don't think we fully know yet. You at least have to consider the possibility of one day, will AI, artificial intelligence, be able to do my job better than I can do it? You at least have to consider that as a possibility. And honestly, I'm not smart enough to be at the forefront of whatever's coming next from a technology standpoint. So here's the only strategy that I have. It really is. In order to defeat whatever the AI version of BA is going to be, in order to defeat that, I've got to be the most human version of myself. And I'm always better in the most human form that I have. That means, faults and all, warts and all, good parts, bad parts, just the human version of me is just sort of the best version of me. And I honestly think, and it may not, I still may one day get taken by AI, but I think the best chance of having that not happen is to be as human as I can possibly be. That the less human you are, the more replaceable you are by some sort of robotic version of yourself. And so given the choice of Kirk Herbstreit saying, I must be the sort of avatar version of what we think a broadcaster is supposed to be, honestly, that's super easy to replace. That's super easy to replicate. We could essentially do that now. And in fact, in some cases, we're probably getting pretty close to do that. Compared to Elle Duncan saying, hey, I'm going to do this show on TV, and I'm going to look into the camera, and I'm going to talk like a broadcaster. But when we go to commercial break, I'm saying go Dawg sick 'em, I'm doing all that kind of stuff. I'm acting like a human being would do. I would say given the choice of those 2 kinds of personalities, the one that has the better chance of surviving the onslaught of AI, which is on the way, is probably the Elle Duncan style more so than anything else. It just is, because anybody who watches sports because they're a fan. Anybody who watches sports because they have a preferred outcome. And anybody who's connected to sports that doesn't have some sort of preferred outcome, that doesn't have some sort of, favorite team, some sort of skin in the game, well, they're essentially kind of a less human version of themselves. And frankly, that should be distrusted more than anything else. So I would say that's that. Here's the second thing. And there's a reason why I think stuff like this feels a little personal to some of us. If you are, like me, many of you are, not just a Georgia fan, but a Georgian, you're not just a Georgia fan, because there are a lot of people who come to the University of Georgia from somewhere else. And so you end up here at UGA, that becomes your team, but you're perhaps from somewhere else. But if you are a Georgia fan who's also a Georgian, here's the sort of thing that you can't help but notice. Doesn't seem to be a lot of that in the sort of major pillars of the national broadcast media. For a long time, this sort of feels like the sort of thing that Southerners have been shut out from. That there's a very, I don't know if it's like a Midwestern vibe or whatever it is, but boy, not a lot of Deep South in the major national broadcast stuff. There's just not. And so therefore, I would say the Southern perspective, specifically in this case, the SEC, oftentimes it doesn't get sort of properly reflected on air because Southerners just for a long time have been sort of shut out of all of this. So when someone dares be a, sort of a Southern fan, Elle likes the Atlanta team, she likes the University of Georgia, suddenly she's getting called out, whereas we've had like New York and Boston sort of thrown in our face forever, but somehow that's sort of considered sort of normal sports fandom, but sort of Southern-themed, Georgia-centric, SEC-centric sports fandom is sort of weird. Your bias is showing, your credibility is threatened. Can't help but notice that sort of thing, and it feels like there's a lot of that sometimes when it comes to college football. But perhaps more importantly than anything, there's this. Kirk Herbstreit sort of gets on my nerves at times, but I do believe that Herbstreit is a really, really important person when it comes to the future of college football. And I just wish he wouldn't act this way. I just really, really do. The sort of self-serious version of Kirk Herbstreit that frankly just seems to have, just a sort of a weird dislike for like rank and file college football fans if you listen to him closely enough. Like this version of Herbstreit just is grating on my nerves. It just is. And perhaps you feel the same way. But there is also a version of Kirk Herbstreit, man, that is just the venerable voice of this sport that we sort of need. Like the future of college football, I think, depends on these kind of elite level, and by elite, I mean at the highest levels, the sort of elite level voices who are really good advocates for the sport, kind of within the sport. We just have to have those guys. And Herbstreit is just sort of tailor-made to be that. Do you realize that he's been doing ESPN College Game Day for 30 years? He's still a young guy. I mean, he's probably, only early 50s, right? But he's been doing the thing for like 30 years. That means he's been doing it long enough to have the credibility of experience, but he also could do it conceivably for another like 20 years, 30 years if he wanted to. And we got to have that guy as the voice for the sport, being an advocate for the sport. But when you don't fully properly realize the role that like fandom plays in the sport, then I think that you're kind of ceding the position you could have as this sport's top analyst. And, Herbstreit mentions like a guy like Pat McAfee by name. Like I'm not necessarily anti-McAfee, but McAfee is different than whatever I need Kirk Herbstreit to be. McAfee's a kind of a cult of personality. He's sort of a showman, a celebrity. And look, there's a place for that in media. He's obviously really successful. But when it comes to college football, you don't necessarily want the personality talking about himself. You want the personality talking about the sport. And so therefore, if you're not careful, this becomes like Stephen A. Smith during the NBA Finals or whatever other analyst they have on there, where it almost kind of becomes a show about the people talking more so than the people talking about the show, which is the game, the sport itself. And so that's why we need the best version of Kirk Herbstreit we can possibly get. And folks, this ain't it. This is not it. Mistaking the role that fandom plays in all of this, calling out Georgia fan Elle Duncan because she dare be a Georgia fan on air and dare have some fun with all of this. That's the only thing that exists in sports, fans having fun. And there's nothing wrong with the personalities kind of getting involved in some of that fun. Now, that said, let me shift gears to this, something completely different, but also, to use the same word again, very fun for Georgia fans. It has been great to watch while I was gone, especially in the early days of the week, all the way through July 4th. This incredible hot streak that Georgia's on just continue. And I think it's really comforting for Georgia fans. In many ways, this is almost kind of like a sort of an old school throwback to like when recruiting news was the lifeblood of the summer and the off season. These last few days have sort of felt like all of that again. It shows that A, Georgia is still a recruiting power, if you had any doubts about that. It also shows you that B, there's a little bit of a flair for the dramatic about how they're capable of doing all of this by lining them up to get, 7 days in a row, dropping another, kind of coming on 4th of July. Just all really fun stuff. In fact, the latest of these, Brayden Fogle, tight end out of Ohio, really good basketball player. You love that skill set transition here to the football world. A 4-star, ranked inside, top 150 or so from both On3 and 24/7 Sports. He commits on July 4th. Our favorite part about this is we saw Todd Hartley on social media putting out the gif of himself as Hacksaw Jim Duggan waving the American flag on the 4th of July. So that's really fun. I know you've been following really closely with Jeff Sintel, Kaylee Manziel, of course, too, on Before the Hedges presented by Kroger, as they've been kind of looking back on all of this. Obviously, James Johnson in the fold. That's one of the biggest gets for me, the big defensive lineman. It's who you had to beat out that made that one so important. Miami, the sort of the hometown advantage, also a big NIL, bidder. Texas is the big bidder there. But Georgia, honestly, from kind of pillar to post, just did a really good job in this recruitment, sort of showing you what it is that Georgia does really well. That was great to see. Chase Calicut also on that Friday, the defensive back from out in Houston. Georgia just adding a lot of big-time prospects right now. It's been really fun to watch. And the other byproduct of all this is it kind of passes the time for us really well. You know what I'm saying? It's like you kind of get into that sort of deep part of the summer. Sometimes the college football season sort of feels like it's a long way away. But when Georgia's knocking out a commitment every single day, all of a sudden, not only is that 2026 class growing in stature, but those days are getting ticked off the calendar as well. And lo and behold, you look up and the 2025 season's right there on the doorstep. And as you get ready for that, you do so with the comfort of knowing that the Georgia Bulldogs have themselves an elite recruiting class here once again. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We're glad you're with us. No matter how you get to us, live on video, and I do mean live back here again today. That feels good to be able to say that. Feels good to be able to do that on video, 10 a.m. across all platforms. That's Facebook, that's YouTube. Many of you watch directly on DawgNation.com, which is a great platform for us as well. Of course, radio, Athens, Sports Radio 960 The Ref, podcasts, wherever you find them, Apple, Spotify, everything else. We're just happy to have you as a part of the program, and so thankful to our friends at Pella Window and Door of Georgia who've made it all possible. And I would say that Pella is really important all throughout the year, but this is one of those moments in which, this time of year, in which the value of Pella just comes shining through in such a big way. And we know this. We've kind of shown these photos before of people getting those new Pella windows installed from our audience. We love celebrating that on air when that happens. And one of the things that I love about it is that I know that people are going to be staying nice and cool and comfortable on the inside of their house this time of year. This is one of those things when it's so hot on the outside, your air conditioning is just working overtime on the inside of your house. That's just one of those things that's the case. And that's expensive, right? I mean, the cost of everything seems to be going up at times, but that AC is just so expensive, especially when it's running full time. So what you don't want is to waste any of that energy, any of that cold air. You don't want it sort of creeping out of your house because of poorly fitted or just inefficient, kind of beyond their shelf life windows. If you sort of feel like, boy, my house doesn't quite feel as cool as it possibly could, maybe that's your AC unit, but there's a chance that it's not your AC unit. There's a chance that it's just the AC that's in your house is not staying in your house. Have you ever considered that as a possibility, that you're spending more than you should to keep yourself not quite as cool and comfortable as you need to be? Well, better windows may be the solution to all that. The kind of technology that Pella Window and Door of Georgia is famous for, it's probably worth having that conversation. In many cases, you're talking about a product that has like the shades and the blinds kind of built into the windows. They're fit perfectly. They're efficient. It's just going to make your house feel better this time of year. And they've got great savings right now, too. How about 0% APR for 72 months? This is one of the most popular promotions that Pella runs throughout the entire year. It's always great to get this kind of savings, this kind of sort of upfront pricing opportunity. 0% APR for 72 months is just an amazing deal. I know you're going to want to take advantage of that today. So here's what I want you to do. Find them online, PellaGA.com/DawgNation. That's PellaGA.com/DawgNation. Or give them a call, 678-638-1429, 678-638-1429. You can also visit them in Duluth and in Dunwoody and sort of see them there in their showroom and kind of have the experience there in the Experience Center, but still great to kind of begin your conversation either online at PellaGA.com/DawgNation or by calling 678-638-1429. Pella Window and Door of Georgia is going beyond. So great to be back with you here today. So great to kind of have our conversation coming up with Jon Stinchcomb in just a moment. We're looking forward to all of that. That's going to be a fun one. And an SEC coach that's kind of been sort of had some fun poked in his direction. We've got more of that coming again today. We'll tell you about that in a little bit. But for now, though, let's already go around the DawgHouse, and it's poured today by our friends at Dr. Pepper, who we're glad to have as a part of all of this here today. Now, while I was away, Pro Football Focus came out with its top 50 list of players for the 2025 season based on its own metrics. Pro Football Focus, some people like the sort of stuff they do. Not everybody does. But it is always, I say, at least fodder for conversation. Only one Georgia player made the list on this, and it's safety KJ Bolden. Let me read you what they say about Bolden, then we'll give you a couple of thoughts here. Bolden comes in at number 42. So you've got Texas with 5 players on the list. Alabama's got 5 players on the list. Clemson's got at least 4 players on the list, I think. Georgia, just the one right now. It is KJ Bolden coming in at number 42. The writers of Pro Football Focus saying, Georgia may have lost superstar safety Malachi Starks, but another one is already waiting in the wings. Bolden, the number 1 safety in the 2024 recruiting class and a top 15 overall prospect, quickly lived up to the hype in his freshman season. Pro Football Focus goes on to say Bolden finished the year as the 8th most valuable returning Power 4 safety per PFF's wins above average metric, whatever that is. His 13 coverage stops tied for the 5th most among football FBS safeties. He also pairs impressive speed with physicality and reliable tackling despite weighing just 185 pounds. So that is what Pro Football Focus says about KJ Bolden. Now, let me say something that's sort of self-evident, and then we'll kind of get more deeply into Bolden here just for a moment. Obviously, if Georgia wants to be what it aspires to be by the end of the season, you can't have just one top 50 player. You just can't. It's okay to begin the season that way. It's not okay to end the season that way. And honestly, I'm not that worried about Georgia having just one top 50 player, even in comparison to Georgia opponents such as Texas and Alabama, who have far more. I'm really not all that worried about that because I do think, you didn't see a lot of Christian Miller last year. You saw very little of Jordan Hall. They're players along the defensive line. I don't think it's a huge leap to think they could be there by the end of the year. When you look at the inside linebacker position, Georgia's got at least 4 inside linebackers who I think could vie for the Butkus Award this year. That's an incredibly deep position. I feel pretty good about what Georgia's going to have the potential of having a cornerback. Now, not all of these individual players are going to break the right way and end up being the sort of top-end, most elite version of themselves. I'm not saying they will. I'm saying I don't see a shortage of potential for some of that to happen. I feel the same way on the offensive side, whether it be fully healthy Ernest Green, Monroe Freeling at offensive tackle, what I think Oscar Delp has a chance to be, what I think Lawson Lucky has a chance to be, what Georgia may have in transfer wide receivers. I just see the potential for a handful of Georgia players to emerge. I don't see a shortage of talent, in other words, on the Georgia roster, despite the fact that Pro Football Focus is not exactly all that impressed with it by now. That's my overall opinion on that. So saying that, let's look specifically at Bolden here for a moment. What does it mean for Georgia to potentially have Bolden as among its best players, or perhaps even its very best player compared to the other top players nationally? What would that mean for UGA? Well, in some respects, it would make Georgia a little bit like, say, Ohio State, who has both and we're going to get more into this list later on, they have the number 1 and number 2 players on this list. The number 2 player on this list is Caleb Downs. So in a roundabout way, what you're saying is Georgia might have a player that either compares favorably to Malachi Starks or compares alongside what a kind of a Caleb Downs impact has been for Ohio State. There's at least a possibility that is true here for KJ Bolden, or at least the vibe that Bolden gives Georgia could be similar to that. And, I thought it was interesting the way that Pro Football Focus sort of described Bolden. Not the biggest guy necessarily, but a guy who's really willing in contact. A guy who'll step up and play the run. I saw that from him in high school at Buford. One of the things that kind of made me very impressed by him, and not that I pretend to be a scout necessarily, but one of the things that made me really feel comfortable in thinking, boy, I think this guy can really do it. And I feel like I see in him what others have seen, was the fact that he just go put his face on people, even though he wasn't nearly as big as some of the guys he was colliding with. Wasn't worried about that. He just sort of feels like a Kirby Smart style defensive back if there ever was one. And when we had our chance to talk to KJ going back to just a few months ago, KJ sort of talked about that part of it, that a year's worth of being coached by Kirby Smart after having a long, deep relationship with him as a recruit. It seems like KJ is growing more and more comfortable with what Kirby Smart is asking from him. This is what Bolden said about that back at the end of December.
You got to be physical. At Georgia, you got to be physical. I definitely learned about Coach Smart. It's hard to win when you're not physical. So, and then just him getting on us every day, him making us compete every day, not giving up on us, letting us be our best every day. So, just being Coach Smart, him coaching the defense a lot. That's been a great experience.
So that's Bolden saying, got to be physical. I want to be that. Kirby Smart demands that. That feels like a good fit. Pro Football Focus sort of also celebrating his work in pass coverage and things like that. But to kind of wrap this up, let me give you kind of one more thing to think about when it comes to Bolden. And this is one of the things that I think could be fun for Georgia if KJ really does become this season one of the very best players in the entire country. Here's a place where you might see an immediate impact for Georgia. Do you know that last year, Georgia was only 97th in America in interceptions? Now, I would say that turnovers are pretty erratic from year to year. It's pretty unpredictable. There are defensive metrics I always favor more so than just the amount of turnovers you're forcing, because some of that's a little bit difficult to predict. In fact, oftentimes it kind of runs counter to the previous year just because this stuff has a way of sort of stabilizing over time. There's a certain element of luck to all of this. You perhaps are aware of that. But nonetheless, it'd still be nice to have more than 97th best. And a guy like Bolden, being as athletic as he is, truly an impressive true freshman season with room to grow from there. If you want to kind of have an idea of where like the immediate impact of a player like this in your secondary, one of the best players in the country playing as a safety for you this year, it might be that way. A Georgia team that wasn't necessarily outstanding at takeaways a year ago, perhaps KJ Bolden leading the way for a little bit of a statistical resurgence in that category here for this upcoming season. And that's one of the reasons why Georgia fans may be very, very excited about having a player of Bolden's magnitude, one of the top players in the country, manning that safety spot in this Georgia secondary here in 2025. And that is Around the DawgHouse, poured today by our friends at Dr. Pepper. And we love summer. Dr. Pepper is a big part of our summer. We also love like the sort of summer blockbuster movie season. That's always a lot of fun. And in celebration of that right now, as you're shopping at your local Kroger, wherever you're picking up your groceries, for your delicious one-of-a-kind flavor of Dr. Pepper, make sure you look for those special Jurassic World Rebirth cans from our friends at Dr. Pepper here right now. So you want the succulent flavor of Dr. Pepper Blackberry or Dr. Pepper Blackberry Zero Sugar? Of course you do. Well, how about in addition to that, some of those specially themed cans? If you love the Jurassic Park movie franchise, that sort of cinema universe, I certainly do. You'll love those Jurassic World Rebirth cans here right now, courtesy of Dr. Pepper. Make sure you take a look at them here today. We love having Dr. Pepper as a part of Around the DawgHouse. All right, we also love having Jon Stinchcomb as a part of DawgNation Daily here today too. So for everything that's been going on with Georgia while I've been away, let's catch up with Jon Stinchcomb here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insight.
Let us say hello to Jon Stinchcomb here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. Jon, hope you got a great 4th of July weekend with your family. A lot of fun. Were we doing the slip and slide into the pond? I know that's the thing we've shown on video from you before. You always have a good time with that. Did that come out here for the 4th of July weekend?
Did as well. It was a beautiful day, and we got to enjoy all of it.
I'm so happy to hear that. It's just a fun time to be with family. That's always kind of a great thing. To kind of dive into Georgia football, we were talking about KJ Bolden a moment ago. Total confession, I like for Georgia to have its best players as close to the football as possible. I want, offensive linemen. I want defensive linemen. I want quarterback. I want those positions closer to the football to be the very best. If I had my preference, that's what I want. I would say there are also premium positions now. You look at who gets drafted the most frequently in the first round of the NFL draft. You'll include wide receiver, edge rusher, things like that. Those are the places where I think you want to be great. Pro Football Focus right now says Georgia's best player on paper is KJ Bolden. And as I was saying a moment ago, I think there's also a way for that to be really good for Georgia too, even though it's not necessarily my preference to have your best player be a safety. For a Georgia team that has not exactly led the world in takeaways the last few years, especially when it comes to interceptions a year ago, that if you have a Caleb Downs level safety, if you have a guy that kind of maintains the sort of first-round draft pick tradition that Georgia's starting to put together at the safety spot, there is a way to be more dynamic defensively when you're really good in the back end. And I guess kind of moving into year two, that's what a lot of people seem to think that KJ Bolden has a chance to bring to UGA.
I certainly think he's capable. I think this, with the evolution of offenses, the ask of the interior of the defense, so whether it's your inside linebackers or the safeties in the middle of the field, they are having to do more. They have to not only play the run, but play the pass, and it's sideline to sideline. So having guys that can run is a must in today's game. You look at KJ Bolden, and that's one of the biggest pieces of his game. I know the clip showed him talking about being physical, and that's because the ask is not only to make plays in the back end, but he's asked to step up and make plays at the line of scrimmage, similar to what we saw Caleb Downs do at Alabama. You look at the SEC championship or the national championship game, the way they play it, it's the ask of a safety is more than just one dimensional. And when you have players that are highly capable at both ends, whether it's defending the pass deep or coming up and stopping a run, I think it makes you more dynamic. It opens up the options. It's something that we've asked Jonell to do in years past and kind of play both. I think KJ is potentially has a little bit higher ceiling as to what he can bring to the table in that space. I do think, along with what you said earlier, that our inside linebackers, whether it's CJ Allen or Cole, I mean, those two guys, I expect great things from. And you need it. The way Georgia plays defense is it's a heady defense. You have to be tuned in. It's not just pin your ears back and sick them at times. There's a lot of communication and recognition and changes that happen before the ball's even snapped. So for these guys to be able to play physical, the first step is to be able to understand where they're supposed to play physical. And I think that's kind of the demands that Georgia puts on their defensive players. And I feel pretty good about the guys we have going into this season.
So to be fair and balanced, you at least have to consider the concern of, well, Georgia's only got one player on this list. Assuming you take Pro Football Focus seriously at all, which some people do, some people don't, I will leave that to people to decide for themselves. But for the sake of conversation, Georgia's got one player on this list. Alabama's got 5. Texas has got 5. You got to play both those teams. Clemson, who Georgia doesn't play, has got numerous players in this list. That's a national championship contender. And what I'm saying, you got to take that seriously. And other lists have reflected a sort of a similar thing where we don't see a lot of, top player lists feature Georgia guys prominently right now. But overall, I'm not that worried about this. I mean, I do think guys like Freeling and Green have a chance to really emerge if they're healthy. Transfer receivers, I think they have a chance to be among the nation's best. I love what Georgia has at linebacker, as you just mentioned. I really like what Georgia can have fully healthy along the defensive line, assuming that's the case. That Georgia has to have elite top-end talent. And the fact that Alabama has been recognized now by numerous lists and publications having so much of that, I'm forced to sort of consider, maybe a reevaluation of Alabama is at least appropriate given how prominent their guys are on some of these lists here right now. I'm at least going to consider all of that. But overall, I'm not that worried about the talent level at Georgia, even though it's not really earning a lot of preseason praise. Do you agree with that?
I love it. I don't think Georgia could be in a better position because a talented player that feels slighted, that underdog, chip on my shoulder, I have something to prove mentality has been a recipe for success at every level. When you look at it and you say, you've got something to prove, that can go both ways. One, it means that you might not have it in-house and you've got something to prove. Or the other side, and this is where I think Georgia sits, They have the talent. It just hasn't been seen by the outside. So you know what the recruitings look like. You know Georgia continues to recruit at a very high level. We have to replace a number of players. Malachi Starks is one of them. He's presented an opportunity for guys like KJ Bolden to come in, and KJ actually, we got to see a little bit of him last year, and that's why he's probably got that recognition. Other players, they're waiting for that. They've earned the opportunity to step in and step up. And when you have talent in-house like Georgia has that may not be recognized on a national scale, it lets them go into this camp saying, I've got something to prove. I've got a chip on my shoulder. I'm going to go out there and prove to the world that they missed at the start of the season. And I think that's a dangerous proposition for every team. You've heard it in years past where, what was it? Nolan Smith was saying, you know, all the national media folks are saying we're going to go 7-5. Nobody said that, but you want to start with that mentality. And right now it's being given to them. It's you're not as good. You're not as good as Ohio State, whether it's as a team, whether it's as an individual. There's many teams that have better players than you. And so you have to do what? You have to go out there and prove it. And I think Georgia has the horses in the stables to go out there and say, we have some work to do, but we can get there.
Yeah, I think you're touching on something that's really important. I think that's kind of the point that I'm kind of getting to here is, which on this show, we have a lot of fun with the so-and-so is getting slept on. Oh, they don't realize how good so-and-so is. He's getting slept on. And it does kind of become the sort of bulletin board material thing of like Nolan Smith, days past, things like that. When appropriate, we do that. We have a lot of fun with it. That's not quite what I think this is. I'll give you a perfect example. I'm not, picking on him necessarily, but I'm just sort of pointing this out. Dalen Everett. Like, I don't think that Dalen Everett's one of the 50 best players in America returning this upcoming season. I don't necessarily think he's getting slept on. But I do think he's a guy that could be on this list by the end of the year. And that's the point I think that you're making, which is that the potential is there for so-and-so to step up. Now, it's sort of up to him whether he does or doesn't, but it's not like, they don't know how good so-and-so is. Well, right now, none of us know how good so-and-so is, no matter who those so-and-sos are. But the good news is, boy, Georgia's got a lot of them. I guess the one guy is probably C.J. Allen. If you've got a top 50 list, you don't have C.J. Allen on it, that's probably pretty weird to me. But other than that, I don't necessarily have a problem with anybody being excluded from this list, and yet I could make a fairly long list of guys who I think could be there by the end of the year. So in other words, I don't know that this list is necessarily bulletin board material for any player that's not on it, but there are several Georgia players who I think could be on lists like this by the end of the year. Does that make sense?
Absolutely does. And I think a big thing when it comes to those lists is statistics. And, the way Georgia is built specifically offensively, and let's flip the side, defensively as well. The reason why we haven't had a lot of edge rushers is we haven't created those situations for one key guy to be, quote unquote, the star. The whole definition, the defining characteristic of this Georgia team historically under Coach Smart is it's balanced. We can attack you in different ways, offensively, defensively. We don't have to rely solely on one area or aspect of our game. And that's actually raised all ships. And so you mentioned one statistic defensively, interceptions. If that goes up, if one player spikes in that category, which very easily could happen, then of course he's going to be one of the names that you're talking about on a national scale next year. I think Nate Frazier is a guy, you stay healthy, the running game gets, that ship gets righted as we expect it to. Then all of a sudden he's a name that might draw more attention. Having a number of, you mentioned this, transfer players that are coming in at the wide receiver position. The fact that we will not lead the entire all of college football in drop passes this coming year. That statistic will change, and that'll just give more opportunities for this offense, more opportunities for success, and better statistics at the end of the year for the wide receivers. So I understand where they get these preseason predictions as to who's going to be the top 50. But I do think Georgia, as they play together as a team, it will lend itself for individuals to kind of percolate to the top, and national media will recognize that as a team, the reason why they find success is because of individual performances. And that list certainly will not mirror itself preseason as it will at the end of the season.
So let me shift gears to something I started the show with. To my knowledge, as a broadcast analyst, you've done Georgia-themed work and you've done New Orleans Saints-themed work, which is the NFL team that you played for. So you have done your broadcast work, if I'm correct here, mostly in the space for the teams that you play. What do you make of Kirk Herbstreit saying, and he's sort of said this sort of thing in the past, this is just the latest example of this, that it's really important to go out there and do a broadcast in such a way that nobody would have any reason to think, well, this guy went to Ohio State. Even though that is true, by the way, that you would do your broadcast in such a way to really try as hard as you could, I'm obviously paraphrasing here, to make people forget that. What do you make of Herbstreit saying that's the sort of neutrality that he pursues?
I think that's almost an old school mentality. I think you look at as things change, you don't have to hide anymore. I think probably when he came into the national scene, there was an expectation that it was totally unbiased reporting, and we're just all going to forget that he played quarterback for Ohio State. Is that realistic? No. Do you have allegiances to your school? Yes. I think we've seen in the past other national media folks recognize their fanship. Like David Pollock's a great example. He would always, he was proud of the fact, still is, that he played at the University of Georgia, was a representative of the Bulldogs, and considers them his home team. But yet never did he make it a hidden factor as to who he is. He was critical at times of Georgia and tried to be unbiased in his evaluation, while also recognizing the fact that he's a fan of Georgia, that he is a product of our system. So I think there's a balance there. I think there's kind of an old school mentality that you couldn't even recognize that is he a little off there? From where I sit, he is. I think you can recognize that, hey, I'm a fan of this school, and can still offer an evaluation that is still fair, that I can be critical of the school that I'm loyal to, especially given the seats that some of these folks hold, Elle included, that she can go out there and, say, hey, I'm rooting for the Dogs. I bark, but also, here's some areas of concern when you talk about this team. So, I get where he's coming from. I think you look at even Saturday morning football and the Pat McAfee effect of we're not as buttoned up and the expectation isn't that it's buttoned up as it used to be, that it's a little less polished, it's a little more real. And I think fans welcome that and recognize that comes with a little more authenticity, even though sometimes it comes across maybe as a little cheesy for some. But I think there's a feel of authenticity that was missed when you try to deny aspects of who you are and where you're coming from.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, like, if you're trying that hard to sort of cover that part up, and this is not a criticism of Herbstreit in particular, but just broadcast in general, if you're trying that hard to cover that up, it kind of makes me wonder, well, what else are you trying to cover up? Because, look, nobody watches sports neutrally. Everybody has some sort of preferred outcome. They either have a team they want to see win, or in some cases, a team they want to see lose. They like this guy, they don't like that guy. Like, everybody has some sort of preferred outcome. If I don't have some sense of what your preferred outcomes might be, well, now I don't trust you at all, because now you're keeping everything a secret. And look, I mean, every broadcast in the NFL played for the Cowboys. Reggie Miller just did the Pacers-Knicks series, having played for the Pacers. It's like, to me, that's sort of part of the fun of sports. And it's the same thing here, where it's like, okay, well, pretty clearly I do a pro-Georgia show, and pretty clearly as a great former Dawg, you are a kind of a pro-Georgia guy. But, John, I'd like to think, whether it be my analysis that I provide every single day, which is really more like commentary, my commentary that I provide every single day, if I'm lying about something, then people are going to notice. And if I'm lying about something, I would certainly say that people have a right to call me out for it. In other words, just because I want Georgia to win and just because I want Georgia to have all the best players and, all the best, outcomes and things like that, well, clearly the truth is never going to be 100% of the way I want it to be or 100% of the way that anybody wants to be. That just because you have sort of a preferred outcome in mind, some sort of, outcome you'd like to see take place, I don't think that precludes you from being able to describe what the actual truth is in the moment. In fact, I'd like to think we do that all the time.
Yeah, I think there is a distinction between, commentary from DawgNation or when I do Saints preseason games and it's the Saints broadcast and whoever we're playing against, the Chargers have their own broadcast. There's an expectation that we are going to spend more time on our team. I thought you brought up a great point with Reggie Miller and national game, national coverage, not expected to be biased. This isn't the Pacers broadcast team. And I thought he did an exceptional job. Everyone recognized that he's got an allegiance to the Pacers, but yet when you listen to his evaluation, I thought he did so fairly and did so at times critically of Indiana and without sacrificing the authenticity of everyone knows where he's coming from. Everyone knows that because of his past, because of his experience and his relationship with that team, there is an allegiance and an affinity there, but it did not stop him from offering a commentary that was of value. And I think that that's what fans appreciate, that don't deny or hide some of the aspects of where you're coming from, embrace them, but do so in a way that's professional, that's honoring of the platform that's been given to you. And I think you can do both without having to sacrifice parts of your identity or authenticity.
So I'm curious of this, having done both kinds of broadcasts, NFL and college. And when you're doing those NFL, you're doing like the games on TV. You're doing preseason games on TV, which is a big platform to be on. I'm curious, my assumption is that the reaction you get from NFL commentary is nowhere near like it would be for college commentary. Like if today, sitting here right now, this is July, there are a lot of people who are on vacation, doesn't matter. If you said so-and-so should be fired or so-and-so should be replaced, like if you could say something right now that would be a 5-alarm fire and have the entire sort of DawgNation on just absolute, tilt. You could do that right now because that's how passionate our college football audience is. Do you feel like you could get the same reaction from Saints fans if during a broadcast you said, I don't know why this guy's even starting. I feel like they should, bring in, whoever, and he should be starting over whatever. Do you feel like you can get the same reaction from Saints fans by saying something that volatile? Because I know good and well that you could absolutely turn DawgNation sideways by saying whether it's the right thing, the wrong thing, whatever, but saying the thing right now. To me, it just seems like very, very different fan bases. Would you say that's probably true?
Yeah, I think not all fan bases are created equal, but this I lived this out this past year. So there's a starting player for the Saints who I was critical of, and I'm a homer. Their Saints organization has been great to me, but I offered a fair critique of this individual player, and it made the circuits, and I was getting calls from across the country about that evaluation. So. Across the NFL, I don't think all the fan bases are the same. I do think that there are a few that have that rapidity that you find mostly in college. And I think that's probably why it felt so similar. My experience in New Orleans is because their fan base, and there are others like them. I would think the Steelers and Cowboys, the Packers in that local market, there is that affinity and relationship that's built that transcends the fact that these are just professionals playing a game. So there are some similarities, but I don't think it spans every team in the NFL like it does college ball.
I've kept you long, and I apologize. Let me just squeeze this in before I let you go. Did you see our friends from 24/7 Sports did their quarter century team for Georgia, you made the offensive tackle position. One of the two offensive tackles was you here for this 21st century so far. So shout out to the folks over there at the 24/7 site, and also congratulations to you for making the quarter century team.
Well, thank you, BA. I'm glad that I was halfway decent at something a quarter of a century ago. So appreciate that recognition.
Hey, listen, but you know, you can be self-deprecating if you want, but there have been a lot of first-round picks at offensive tackle since you played at Georgia. So, yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, for all of us, the early 2000s start to feel like a little you know, a long time ago. But there have been a lot of good offensive tackles since then. So that's a pretty strong position to be able to hold on to through those couple decades.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm grateful for the recognition. I appreciate the acknowledgement that, you know, there was football that was being played 25 years ago and not just within the last 10 years.
That's
right.
But
like you said, there's a lot of great players to choose from. I'm sure they could have gone a couple different directions for a number of spots, but grateful that I was able to slide in there.
Jon, thanks for your analysis. Always fun stuff. Appreciate it. We'll look forward to talking to you very soon.
I appreciate it, BA. Go Dogs.
Go Dogs.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, Kirk Herbstreit here's us saying, go Dogs. He's going to be beside himself. He's going to go on another podcast and chastise us all for that. I mean, the point that I make all the time, we can bring the music down just a little bit. The point that I make all the time is, and I think I've even said this to people directly, like, if you hear something that you think comes, whether it be from me or Elle, Duncan, or anybody else, from a pro-Georgia perspective that doesn't quite sound right, then by all means, call it out. Call it out. Recognize it for what it is, if that's the case, right? I mean, but let's not ask people to be robotic versions of themselves, because the people who are robotic versions of themselves, that's going to be the first group of people that AI comes and replaces. Just keep that in mind. We're going to try to keep that from happening as long as we possibly can. Now, let's get ready to go cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And I was just listening to somebody in our reading from somebody in our YouTube comment section before the show began today saying, hey, just recently they're on Perfect Day Coco K, had my Georgia gear on, and there is nothing I love more than watching folks represent that G in a place like Perfect Day Coco K. And I love the Royal Caribbean cruise ships because so many of them sail to Perfect Day Coco K. In fact, it's the only way you can get to this wonderful private island right there in the Bahamas is on board a wonderful ship like Utopia of the Seas. That's the one we sail on for our DawgNation cruise. We'll be back on it again next April, and it's the one you can sail on right now. Also coming soon, like the next few weeks, Star of the Seas set to make its debut. Icon of the Seas, the first in the Icon class of ships. So many great experiences, and a great time for you right now to reach out to our friend Jessica Slater and get on your own Royal Caribbean Cruise vacation. Give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com. She'll get you ready to go for a great Royal Caribbean Cruise vacation here in 2025 or early 2026. It is going to be an outstanding time. Make sure you get ready to enjoy all of that. All right. Let's get ready to go cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean here right now. And so we talked about the Pro Football Focus Top 50 list. Let me give you a couple of other brief thoughts about that. First of all, Jeremiah Smith, Caleb Downs, Ohio State gets the credit for having both of the top players in the country, reigning national champs. They have them. And I do think that Smith is going to be an interesting player this season. You know, a year ago, kind of one of our sort of boldish predictions that turned out not to be true, is I thought that Smith might insert himself into the Heisman conversation a year ago. Didn't quite happen, but he did have an outstanding freshman season. Now, listen, this is a little bit of a different feel for the Ohio State offense. You know, Chip Kelly's not there anymore. You know, Brian Hartline's going to get his chance to show what he's all about. It's a younger quarterback that we've seen the Buckeyes have in a little while. So there's going to be a little bit of an interesting feel around the Buckeye offense. But listen, I think it's still going to be built around their wide receivers. Smith, obviously, the best of those. And I do think if you're kind of thinking about your sort of early list for who will be in New York, who are the most likely Heisman finalists, and we don't see wide receivers win this award a lot. We did see Devontae Smith do it a few years ago. I think Jeremiah Smith's obviously going to be there, and by now Caleb Downs has certainly proved himself. as we mentioned before, there are a few teams that are just sort of all over this list. Clemson with Peter Woods and Cade Klubnik, the quarterback. Just TJ Parker, that's the edge rusher. They got 3 players in the top 10. It is a very, very compelling reemergence, I guess is the word I'm looking for Clemson. When they lost to Georgia 34-3 a year ago, first of all, I thought that was a really impressive win for Georgia. It's interesting you never hear that mentioned by anybody ever, but nonetheless, we thought it was a very impressive win for Georgia. But we also kind of thought, hey, maybe this is the sort of end for Clemson on the national stage. But the truth is, the kind of classic old school, very good front line, defensively, front seven type stuff defensively for Clemson, that's kind of back again this year. They're good at quarterback again this year, among the nation's best. This sort of feels like one of those Clemson teams that's going to be more than just a team that probably should win the ACC. This is a team that maybe could do more than that. Sort of feels like Dabo Swinney, who stayed really close to stuck to his principles, has kind of stayed committed to his beliefs. Feels like Clemson's sort of back again. I think they deserve some credit for that. And I will tell you, and lists like this have had an impact on me, that one of the big changes I've had in my mind over the course of this offseason, and to go back to sort of a theme of today's show, this is not my preferred outcome. This is not what I wish was true. This won't earn me points with anybody in our audience. But honestly, I have too much respect for my audience to lie. An opinion I've started to kind of sort of believe in a little bit more deeply as the offseason's gone along. I'm a little higher on Alabama now. And I think that the team that I've probably reconsidered most from say January when the calendar year begins until now, we're more than halfway through and, getting 8 weeks away from the start of the season. I would say the opinion that I've evolved on almost the most, probably the most, is that I'm pretty high on Alabama right now. And if you say the SEC is likely to have 4 playoff teams, I'd take Alabama to be one of them. I really would. That's sort of sight unseen with whatever they do at quarterback, whether it's Ty Simpson for the whole year or maybe, Simpson gets replaced by one of the other guys they have. With some of the unknowns there, I'd put Alabama in my college football playoff right now. I really would. And not only do I view, and many of you I think see the same way, that Alabama is Georgia's most important game, on paper right now, it looks to me to be about as tough as any game that Georgia will play, including the game against Texas. That Alabama, it just sort of feels like, they're kind of hanging around here a little bit right now. In fact, we're going to have more on them in just a moment. But kind of an interesting look at this Pro Football Focus Top 50 list. A lot of Texas guys on there. Georgia has to play them. A lot of Bama guys on there. Georgia has to play them. Kind of an interesting reflection of what Georgia's facing as it pursues another trip to the college football playoff and perhaps another national championship. Some high-end talent on some of these teams that Georgia's going to have to compete with. Let me shift to this. So last week we talked about the Auburn fan who goes on the message board using some of the golf handicap data. You have to sort of input your scores to update your handicap. That Hugh Freeze apparently had been playing a lot of golf during the month of June, so much so that Elle.com picked this up. It kind of got aggregated from there. Now the golf media is reporting on this too because it's just kind of one of those things that just went kind of viral. We think it's a really fun story of, coinciding with Auburn having some real struggles in recruiting. I saw where they lost a receiver to Kentucky. They got flipped to Kentucky from Auburn. Just kind of an ugly run for Auburn recruiting right now. And it happens to coincide with Hugh Freeze playing a lot of golf. Now, here's what we believe. We said this the other day. We are not going to golf shame anyone. We think, resting your mind is as important as resting your body, and getting away from work every now and then, going and playing a little golf, kind of sort of makes some sense to do. We've seen Hugh Freeze, kind of doing this some. He played the Chick-fil-A event, what used to be called the Chick-fil-A event, not too long ago with the other coaches. He was at the the Regions event with the PGA Tour champion. So we've seen Hugh Freeze playing some golf. We have seen that. We don't necessarily sort of mock him for doing that. We're not going to golf shame people for getting on the links every now and then. We like to do that ourselves. However, it was funny to see Lane Kiffin, I think we have this we can show you, on X, sort of bringing this story back, going back to a tweet from Hugh Freeze on May 19th, he says, great time at the first stand. This is Hugh Freeze's tweet. Basically kind of a get-together, a golf event between a couple of local clubs there in Alabama. Hugh Freeze's team got the win there on that. He shared that on X, and being the sort of online troll that he can be, Lane Kiffin, I think this is really funny, retweets this from May. Yesterday he does this and says, great job, coach. Your game is on fire. Obviously kind of throwing a couple of logs on the fire for something that Hugh Freeze is getting a lot of criticism for right now. I think that's really funny. I'm not bothered by Hugh Freeze playing golf. I think you deserve a chance to sort of step away and do that every now and then. It'd be nice to sort of mix in a few recruiting wins in the summertime while you're also out there working on your golf game. But pretty funny stuff. But Lane Kiffin sort of always knowing the exact right thing to say, seemingly the exact right time. No doubt his fellow coaches getting a big laugh out of that. Hugh Freeze getting mocked for playing a lot of golf here right now. Lane Kiffin sort of bringing that back. And by the way, speaking of Alabama, one more story to give you. Honestly, they've had their own recruiting hot streak going as of late, really knocking down a bunch of big wins. They just got the commitment from the 5-star safety, Jira Edwards. So, this is a situation where here in 2025, both in recruiting and on the field, Kalen DeBoer needs to put his stamp on the Alabama program. This sort of feels like DeBoer's version of Alabama football now, and not just the version he inherited from Nick Saban. And you got to be honest that right now they are getting some recruiting wins. That they are, people have kind of criticized Alabama of, maybe they don't have as much NIL funds other programs do. Maybe they don't have the same access to money in the sort of compensation war that Alabama's at a disadvantage compared to their programs. Well, this summer, they've been on a pretty nice little recruiting run here as of late. And if we are of the belief that oftentimes recruiting success is sort of a precursor to on-field success, well, you have to at least acknowledge that Alabama's on kind of a nice run here right now. Jira Edwards, the latest example of that. We will make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And as we wrap up here today, first of all, great to be back in the chair again doing the show. We love all of that. Also, great to be able to think about the season itself not being very far away from right now. In fact, that's the theme of our Golden Shoe today. Our buddy Wyatt Fielden sharing that we're just 8 weeks away from the start of the season. He says, 8 weeks away, go Dogs. Sent a nice collection of pictures to go along with that. We are excited about that, man. Season's going to be here before you know it. Thrilled to be able to settle in and enjoy it all. SEC Media Days next week. Fall camp really right there on the other side of that. Several big commitment announcements that are of note for Georgia, kind of connected to all of that. So we're going to settle in, get ready to enjoy it as he's official. Top 25s come out and things like that. AP coaches poll not too far away. We're just going to get into it all. So great stuff, Wyatt. We'll give you a golden shoe for that. Lousy, stinking Gators. How about a Gatorhater updater? 1,700 3 days. That's how long it's been since Florida's beaten Georgia. That's good news. We'll see you tomorrow at DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised. The price is promised. You can trust R.S. Andrews on all that. By the way, I love that little nice new little animation with the R.S. Andrews. That's a lot of fun. That's great to be able to see. All right, we're going to get your comments. We're going to kind of find out what's on your mind, and we'll have some fun here today. Let me start with YouTube. Let's see what's going on. Paul Moon says, I wanted Jira Edwards for Georgia, but not losing sleep over it. Our defensive back class is elite. Yeah, I don't think that Georgia has anything to worry about when it comes to its own 2026 class. But, once again, as an example of our ability to just sort of say whatever we think the truth is, Alabama's been on a nice little run in recruiting right now, for sure. P. Rich says, can't lie, Bama's getting some elite level guys, but that's nothing new. Yeah, they've always been kind of a factor in the recruiting trail for the entirety of the Kirby Smart era. I do think a lot of this is going to go to, and ultimately it's the wins on the field that are going to matter most. You can't lose 3 times if you're Kalen DeBoer here this year, we would say. That's where he's going to really have to prove himself. but obviously sort of building up at least some goodwill with the recruiting process here right now. Hunter Lacey says college players develop so much from year to year, it's hard to know who could pop off and be a great player that year. To a degree, that's probably true. But I also am a big believer in kind of like positional value. For instance, we sort of know what the New York Yankees center fielder is going to do in a given year based on what the Yankees center fielder typically does. Now, 5 years from now, we may not know the name of who the Yankees center fielder is going to be, but based on like the previous 10 to 15 years, we have a pretty good idea what his production is going to be. That's sort of the basis around like sort of a wins above replacement type stat, or one of those things you see in baseball is we just kind of know what the various positional values for the various teams are. College football sort of works the same way. That, who's Georgia's, starting running back going to be? Well, okay, we'll figure that out between, Frazier and the guy that comes from Illinois and Roderick Robinson, who has a nice video out there right now, kind of showing himself doing some hard work. We're going to learn some of that, but we have a pretty good idea what that stat line's likely to be based on now like going on 10 years of Kirby Smart being the Georgia coach. So I would say that for programs, it's hard to change your fortunes very quickly. You spend big on the transfer portal, you have one big signing class. Like that only makes you so much better on the field. You are still likely to produce at a level similar to what you've been producing. That over the course of time, you can sort of deliberately, methodically upgrade the performance of your positions. We've seen that happen with Kirby Smart over the course of his time here. Almost every position's sort of innate value has been raised because of how consistently Georgia's been putting elite talent into those positions. But there's another kind of thing that there's just no shortcut to that, where there can be in basketball. Part of the reason why we see basketball players in NIL getting paid so much money is because there's only 5 guys on the floor. You can kind of change everything with, just a few good players. Now, it doesn't always work that way. Rutgers had 2 lottery picks and didn't make the tournament. So it didn't always work that way. But you can change fortunes quickly in basketball. In football, because it's 11 guys in the field, 44 guys and you're too deep, you just don't change things necessarily all that quick. By the way, our buddy G. Grace agrees, saying it's a must that DeBoer make the college ball playoff this year. We need the recruiting to stay consistent. So if we would say, okay, so the 3 teams that are easiest to pencil into the playoff, the SEC, Georgia, Bama, Texas, they have the best odds to make the playoff. They have the highest projected win totals. So if that's the 3, if we assume the SEC is likely to get 4, although it didn't get 4 a year ago, who is the next most likely team? That's where I think the conversation gets pretty interesting. Alan Hampton says in 2026, our schedule is going to flip to a schedule that's more similar to what Missouri or Texas have been playing with the weaker teams in the conference. Here's what I'm going to tell you. Alan, it might happen that way. I mean, it would stand to reason that you just sort of flip-flop and play the other SEC teams you haven't been playing. But we don't know that for sure on 2 fronts. A, we don't really know if you just flip-flop and play the other SEC teams, well, how good is LSU going to be then? Is that going to be a team that finally figures something out? How good is Oklahoma going to be then? Are they one of those teams that sort of finally figure something out? Texas A&M, it could be sort of like if you flip-flop the teams, what those teams look like by the time you play them. Maybe they've had the incremental improvement. All of a sudden now they sort of count as tough games the same way that these Bama, Texas, Ole Miss have been counting as tough games in recent years. That could be the case. But even more important than that, we don't have any idea what the SEC schedule is going to look like in 2026. We don't have any idea. Is it 8 games? Is it 9 games? Is it 8 games where you just flip-flop and play the other teams? Or do they try to preserve the secondary rivalries like Georgia-Auburn, Alabama-Tennessee? We don't know. And I don't think the SEC knows right now. They will, if recent tradition holds, they will announce it sometime during the fall of what the next year's schedule is going to be. But is it a permanent scheduling model? Is it a kind of a weird one-off scheduling thing again? We don't have any idea, and that's really wild, but it is also true. Paul Moon, I'm mentioning for South Carolina that if Lenora Sellers is that dude, USC might make a serious playoff run. It could certainly happen for them because the same way we kind of say, hey, Ohio State may have the best offensive and defensive player in the country. PFF seems to think they do. Clemson's among the best with guys like Peter Woods on one side, Cade Klubnik on another. Listen, South Carolina's right there. You can say that in the SEC, Gamecocks may have best offensive and best defensive player. Dylan Stewart, the edge rusher, Lenora Sellers, the quarterback. They are in that conversation right now, which gives them a very good chance of making the playoff. It's just really hard. It's just really hard to make that move. It just really is. For all the teams trying to erase that third loss, that's just a really tricky thing to do. In other words, if you sort of think about 6-2 in the SEC, there's just not a lot of 6-2, 5-3 in the SEC. That sort of football version of the middle class, we just don't have a ton of that. We'll have a team that'll kind of run through the league undefeated every now and then. Sometimes that's been Georgia. We'll have teams that kind of scuffle their way to 500 in the league, 4-4, something like that. You don't see a lot of teams in the SEC with a true winning record in conference on a year-to-year basis. That's sort of sort of second tier, just doesn't always fully materialize. So, avoiding that third loss, not an easy thing to do necessarily. RKD says, I don't think that Auburn wins more than 7 games this year. They were a team that I have had pegged for a turnaround. Some of the weirdness around the program makes me wonder if I might be wrong about that, but I have wondered that. Randy Hall asking if I had any golden shoe moments during my vacation. Not necessarily, just a nice time, just really fun, just relaxing. Love being with my family. It's just sort of a different experience with your kids when everybody's unplugged. It just is. And, my wife and I are the same way, where it's we have very happy family life. We're, I would say, very connected, but we're always moving from one thing to the next. We just are. And I wouldn't really change that. I don't think if I could. It's nice to be involved in life. Way better to be moving too fast than moving too slow, I would say. Within reason, I would say that's definitely the case. But when no one's got anything to do, when everybody's just kind of around, the sort of experiences you get to have in those moments, just completely different. A big believer. Everybody deserves a vacation, and I hope everybody gets one. SEM Dog says, welcome back, BA. We were all very well behaved in your absence last week, and that's our story, and we're sticking to it. Yeah, I'm going to trust that y'all were, even if I'm not quite so sure that's the case. Very funny. Ken Holcomb says that Kaylee, Connor, and Jeff did a great job in my absence. There's no doubt that's true. I'm sure that's the case. Third Wheel mentioning other media types who, kind of avoid some of the, I guess, the sort of fan-based criticism. Yeah, I just think a lot of that is just, as I said during the show, I think a lot of that's just really, really silly. In fact, even when we used to do SEC Country Live, oftentimes I do SEC Country Live wearing a Georgia shirt. If you're not willing to sort of put your full life on display for a broadcast situation, then, to me, that creates all kinds of other trust issues. So even when we were doing SEC Country Live, a lot of times I'd wear just sort of the generic SEC Country shirt, but oftentimes I'd wear Georgia gear. And we're going to talk about Tennessee, and we're going to talk about LSU, we're going to talk about Auburn, we're going to talk about whatever. But just know the person that's talking about it has a life when he's not on camera, and this is what that person does. I think it's just sort of weird to make people think you're a robot. I just think that's a really weird thing to do because, Like eventually there will be robots doing this job, and I don't think you want to be one of them. Senior Dog 54 says he thinks the lane train and Ole Miss are going to be third in the SEC behind Georgia and Alabama. Could be the case on that. Sounds like you're down on Texas. I can't quite get there on that as of yet. I also don't think this crop of transfers for Ole Miss this year quite the same as the transfers they brought in a year ago. So I'm probably not that high on Ole Miss, but I've also been wrong before. SEM Dog mentioning Missouri. I've said this before. I think that Missouri on paper, I don't quite think to the playoff level, but if you're looking for a team that could exceed its win total, I think that Missouri's one of those teams. I do. They're projected 7.5. I think they could exceed that win total for sure. In fact, it's one of my predicts they will. DT also mentioned the Braves. Yeah, I mean, look, they've obviously fallen apart. And we were worried about this, and our buddy Savannah Bryan, I'm not sure if he's in here today. His sort of dire prediction about the Braves to begin the season right now just sort of seems like it's far more likely to be true. I have for a while been saying that I thought that people were giving up on them too soon. I haven't fully waved the white flag as of yet. Like the one thing I've always leaned on is they do have good pitching rotation, but now all the pitchers are injured. It's about done, I guess. Just destined to be a bad season. I don't know why they have not been able to recapture the offensive magic from 2023. I don't know. I would say there's a clubhouse vibe from this team as an outsider who's not in the clubhouse that seems like it's just missing. I mean, the magic of 2021 is clearly gone. It's obvious they miss guys like Freddie Freeman, Dansby Swanson. It's obvious they miss that. I don't think they're getting the same level of leadership for whatever reason. It's not a fun team to watch right now. I still love them. It's my team, but they are not fun right now. Let's see what else. Anything else here at DawgNation.com before I go to Facebook?
During our segment with Connor and Kaylee on Thursday, we did SEC coaches you'd want to bring to a cookout.
Okay.
Who would you want to bring to the cookout?
Sam Pittman.
Non-Sam Pittman division.
Yeah, first of all, Sam Pittman is the answer. Pittman's just seems like he'd be a lot of fun, know his way around a cookout. He is, I would say, the most fun coach in the SEC. That's why I'd like to have him there. Second to that, probably Shane. I think Shane Beamer would be fun in a situation like that. Shane Beamer, to me, also comes across like a real guy. Like, it's not Brian Kelly. It's not Hugh Freeze. Certainly not Billy Napier. To me, Shane Beamer comes across like a guy who has a genuine personality, sort of a real guy, sort of easy to talk to. Honestly, I think the cookout version of Kirby Smart is a lot different than the sort of coaching persona would lead you to believe. Like, Kirby comes across as one of these guys that is sort of always watching film and always making recruiting calls. And to an extent, that's true. But I have every reason to believe that Kirby also knows his way around a cookout too. I think that Kirby's probably pretty good in a situation like that. Like when he's, when it's time to be at the cookout, he probably knows how to do that. But I believe that Beamer's probably pretty fun in a situation like that. I believe that's probably true. Randy Hall asking about Caden Prothro. Yeah, I'm just sort of getting back into this here right now. I still am, I reckon, as optimistic as I've been about that. I don't know that we'll have a live broadcast for Prothro. I don't know, but I'm as optimistic about Prothro as I have been. Yeah, I still feel good about that, but I've also been away. So if there has been bad news that's materialized while I've been gone, and by the way, I don't think the Brayden Fogle thing changes that. I mean, Georgia would have liked to have Bowman in Prothro, so I don't think Fogle changes any kind of feeling about that really at all. Let me get some Facebook comments. And maybe this will be the week I get signed back into my Facebook on my laptop. All right. David Wayne Carroll, speaking of Atlanta teams, mentions the Falcons saying, depending on Penix, Falcons could possibly make the playoffs, even win a playoff game. Their defense could be significantly better. Yeah, it seems like you have a chance. And I know that a lot of people kind of criticize this, and I guess from a trade value perspective, it wasn't smart. I sort of like James Pierce for the Falcons. Obviously, we love Jalen Walker. But to also get Pierce too, I think I sort of like that okay. Now, did you give up too much for him? Probably so. But if you're Terry Fontenot, you know you're going to get fired, unless this team wins. So, of course, you're going to mortgage the future on that. That's the sort of, dilemma you kind of find when you put a guy in charge. You're trying to have a sort of a long-term mentality as an organization, but you've got a leader of the organization sort of working on a short-term mindset. You're going to have those sort of contradictions from time to time. But are you glad, no matter what you had to get him, are you glad to have Pierce? I think you probably could be. And you're sure, look, I just think that Jalen Walker is going to be a real value add for them. And I don't dislike Penix. I really don't. To me, and I've never gone back and look at the numbers, but the mental picture I have, am I wrong for saying this? That Penix playing for Indiana in 2020, that version of Penix just ran a lot more than the guy who played at Washington. Am I not right? Does that not sound right to you? That Penix was just a more athletic version of himself at Indiana than he was at Washington? That's the Penix I'd like to see for Atlanta. Not a guy who's like a run-first quarterback or even a guy who runs frequently. I just want him to run some. If he can just extend a few third downs or something like that, just give the defense one more thing to think about. Occasionally with his feet, I think that could be valuable. Ralph Price says vacation means getting away, and I'm glad that you got away with your family, BA, and put them first. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, my family, these times, really, really important. You wouldn't take anything for it. Ken Holcomb says the Braves have too many injuries this season, can't come back from that slow start with so many folks hurt. It sort of feels like that's the way we're trending for sure. Billy Cloud says to say a prayer for the people in Texas. Yeah, I'll confess on this. When I am away, one of the things that I do is I get almost completely away from my phone. And so for the most part, I've missed a lot of the story involving the Texas flooding. I know how serious it is. I know some of it, I guess the details of it. I'm probably not as well versed in that as I would be if I had just been around all week, but I did really try to get away from the news, but obviously have been made aware of just how sad and scary that situation is. Very, very, it's just terrible. Jeff Ingram says the biggest Braves issue is the other teams can pitch around our two hitters. Yeah. Like scapegoating Kevin Seitzer in retrospect seems like a pretty weird thing to do. This is an offense that's not really consistent at all just 2 years after being the greatest offense anybody had ever seen. Like, how do you make sense of that? I just don't know. Matthew Goodwin wondering if Georgia will sign more than 30 players in the class of 2026. I'm never the expert on the numbers about, whether it be how many guys you have room for in your roster or how many guys you're going to sign. I let the number crunching be done by others, but obviously I think there's a very good chance that Georgia does sign in excess of 30 this year. Jeff Ingram checking in from Scottsdale. Appreciate that. Thank you for being here. David Wayne Carroll mentioning the possibility of pro throw. Yeah, July 12th looms is a pretty big day for Georgia. You got a couple of big names, Derek Cooper, Caden Prothrow, both set to announce. Georgia feels like it could win both of those. Also, you've got Tyler Atkinson looming here in the very near future, too. Let's see what else. Let me go back to YouTube. By the way, UGA Marine also mentioning Texas pursuit of Caden Prothrow. I guess there has been some of that as of late. Like I said, I've been kind of away. So if there's bad news, y'all let me know what it is. G. Grace likes the direction the Falcons are going in. Hopefully that'll be the case. Brock Crafton mentioning the role that Arthur Blank played in being, the building of Mercedes-Benz Stadium. Yeah, I mean, part of the thing that for me is really sad is that I do think that if you want to go back years ago, Arthur Blank was a guy that I would have put in the category of great owner. Pre-Mercedes-Benz Stadium, Blank was willing to invest like $100 million of his own money into upgrading the Georgia Dome in the hopes the Falcons would get a Super Bowl in Atlanta. Like, this is a guy who I think he wanted to be a great owner. And I think that he wanted the Falcons to be a model organization. I think his heart was really in the right place about that. I think what happens is that winning is just hard. It's just hard. And I think that, as the dream of winning a Super Bowl started to just sort of disintegrate, I think that Blank kind of got interested in other things. And I think that there's a certain loyalty to whether it be paying the wrong players late in their career too much money or keeping guys around the organization for too long. I just think that Blank, once the dream of winning a Super Bowl started to feel like a pipe dream, I think that he kind of shifted his priorities, if I had to guess, to something else. I think he kind of started to value sort of a legacy of loyalty more so than the legacy of a championship that he would have originally dreamed of. But there was a time in which I thought that Blank was a really good owner. I don't know that I think that as much anymore. But there was a time that I thought, and obviously the presence of Mercedes-Benz Stadium is a great example of that, really pushing Atlanta to have a state-of-the-art facility. We obviously love it for college, football playoff games and SEC championship, things like that. We're lucky to have a stadium like that. Blank plays a huge role in it. I would say that most of his influence, though, on the Falcons over the course of the last decade have resulted in changes for the worse. Jonathan Aaron does not want me to sign back into Facebook. He says Georgia's been on a recruiting heater ever since we were signed out. Maybe that's the case. Let's see what else. So do we now have a thing on YouTube that's similar to the old top fan badge on Facebook? Is that what this is? Certainly seems that way. I have to say it's pretty distracting for me, but it appears that's the way. RKD does like James Pierce of the Falcons. Yeah, I think I do too. By the way, RKD very high on Gunnar Stockton here this year. We're going to talk about Gunnar Stockton tomorrow because there are a couple of things I've been thinking about Stockton that I think could be really fun for this upcoming season. We're going to talk more about that tomorrow. For now, though, let's get a couple more comments and we're going to go. Kent Holcomb says the Braves should have kept Freddie and Dansby. I like Olsen, but Freddie was the leader of that team. Yeah, I mean, obviously, Freddie's continued to play very well since leaving, and that just seems to be missing. I mean, you just don't get the impression this team enjoys playing with each other the way that the championship of 2021 seemed to really enjoy playing with each other. Now, some of that's just perception probably. Nothing seems like it's fun when it's not working. But, boy, there is a vibe that seems to be missing. Matt Rukavina says Gunnar was at the Manning Passing Academy last week. My wife has a friend whose son attended. That's really interesting about having that connection to the event. Maybe we'll talk to Jake Fromm about that because I know that Jake had a really great experience out there. What perhaps it was like for Gunnar to be a part of that. That's a good thank you for bringing that up, Matt. I appreciate that. Anonymous Handle says, do we know if Stockton is the absolute QB1? Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think that Georgia's hope for Ryan Puglisi is that he becomes the sort of backup they feel like they could put into a game if need be. In other words, Puglisi could have a really bright future at Georgia. I think that Georgia thinks that he could. But Gunnar Stockton is the guy they're preparing to be the starting quarterback. They're not going to really announce it that way because that's just not really what Kirby Smart does. But if we've been around for a while, right? So we're able to kind of watch how this is all playing out. Gunnar Stockton is their guy. Any sort of pretense in the, any sort of suggestion otherwise is just a sort of a play on cheap, easy content. But Gunnar Stockton is the quarterback for Georgia. Georgia won't announce that, but that's what's going to happen. And that's sort of always been the case. Tennille says she's the inventor, and I still have this. I have it on display in my home. The top fan badge hat that Tennille had made. She says that means my hat still applies over here to YouTube now, too. That's exactly right, Tennille. Because the top fan badge went away on Facebook. That doesn't exist anymore, right? Let's see what else. I'm getting criticized by Bill Sanders here for something. I can't quite figure out what it is. David Wayne Carroll says that Chipper Jones should be the Braves hitting coach. Listen, I think he'd be a good one. I don't think that Chipper wants the day-to-day. I think he likes being around the organization. I don't think he wants to be a full-time hitting coach because if he did, I think the Braves would be probably pretty happy to have him. Or someone certainly would, but I don't think that's necessarily what he wants.
You know how many walks Michael Harris has had since May 16th?
How many walks Michael Harris had since May 16th? How many?
0.
Oh, no. Yeah, he's had an awful year. He's had an awful year. And this is one of those things where I feel like this is the kind of the version of sort of professional athlete I feel like I can relate to. I just sort of feel like, the daily grind of baseball, where if it starts going bad for you, it's sort of hard to shake that out. I'm a terrible golfer. But if it goes even worse for me, if I get into a kind of a bad funk, I have a hard time getting out of it. And it just seems like for Harris right now, that's what it is. Cannot get out of that funk. Cannot get out of it.
You think you could draw in almost 2 months of baseball 1 walk against a major league pitcher?
I might could stand there and hope for the best on that. Yeah, maybe so. I might could hope for the best. Yeah, so I'm trying to figure out what Bill Sanders was criticizing me for, what I missed in here. DMart42 says that Pug, meaning Ryan Puglisi, is the most important player of the offseason. He needs to show enough to let the staff use Gunner's arm and legs as a design in the offense. Biggest difference between the Texans and the Notre Dame game. Yeah, I think that's interesting. And I'll give you all a bit of a preview of this. Here's what I'm sort of thinking about for tomorrow. I think one of the ways in which Gunner might be valuable to Georgia is as a short yardage runner. I'm sort of wondering. Now, the point that DMart's making is if you feel okay about putting Puglisi in the game, then you feel okay about running with Gunner a little bit more. That pretty clearly they just took the running game completely out of the Sugar Bowl. That was not a factor in that game at all. That at the time, they just apparently maybe didn't think Puglisi was ready. By perception, you might think that was true. And so therefore, they were trying to be very careful with Gunner. Well, the best version of Georgia probably does involve some of Gunner's legs. That's the point that DMart's getting to. I think we're going to talk tomorrow about, just keep in mind, Stetson Bennett had 10 rushing touchdowns in 2022. 10 rushing touchdowns. That's a lot. That's like 70 extra points for a season. You think about playing close games against good teams. What would 70 points spread out across an entire year? What could that potentially mean for you? I'd say it means perhaps kind of a lot. How can Georgia get some of that? We may talk more about that tomorrow. John McAleer says you can't play not to lose. You got to try to play to win. Do get that, but also, there's always going to be some managing of, personnel that goes on a sideline too. All right, we're going to get ready to go. Back at DawgNation.com one more time. DT says that Gunner's a fullback who can throw. Yeah, I don't quite know I'd go quite that far. Like, that's what people kind of thought that Tim Tebow was. I think that Tebow is a good bit. Maybe I'm wrong about this. Gunner's probably not quite as big as people think that he is, but he's also not wildly different size-wise than like Jalen Hurts. I mean, I think Hurts is 6'2", 220. I think Gunner's listed 6'1", 215. Not quite a fullback necessarily, but a willing, he's a football player. Willing contact, no problem kind of putting his face in there. Can he get you 1 or 2 yards every now and then in kind of a tush-push style situation? I mean, that's a big difference. I mean, I bet you Georgia, what was Georgia in third down conversions a year ago? Let's see. I'm not going to find this now. But that's kind of one of the things on my mind right now. Better short yardage stuff from your quarterback might make a big difference. Cody BMW MC says, I think that Gunner's built like a tight end, but he can throw. I mean, he's, like I said, he's not quite as big as some people I think he is. But at the same time, he is so willing when it comes to contact that there are ways to use that without putting him in harm's way too much, because he can't take too many hits like the one he took against Texas. When he kind of tried to lower his shoulder, took the big hit, can't do too much of that. But you don't want to you don't want to coach the kind of sort of swagger out of him either. All right. All right, we're getting ready to go. Y'all have a great day. Y'all check out RS Andrews online, rsandrews.com. Air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric. Obviously, this time of year, we're thinking about that AC. That means you're thinking about getting your air conditioning tuned back up to factory fresh specs. Get some new life out of your old unit. Our friends, Dari, and the entire team at RS Andrews can tell you how. So find them online, rsandrews.com. Air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric. Stay cool and comfortable this summer with a refreshed AC unit. Get it tuned back up to factory fresh specs. Find them online, rsandrews.com. Have a great day. Back tomorrow, DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We'll look forward to talking to you then.